This is Ashley Newby, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, cultural workers, political organizers, and everyone in between in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. I'm Ashley Newby, and today we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Chad Williams, who is the Samuel J. and Augustus Spector Professor of History and African American Studies at Brandeis University. He specializes in African American and modern U.S. history, African American military history, the World War I era, and the African American intellectual history. He is the author of Wounded World, W.E.B. Du Bois, and the First World War, which was named Best Book for 2023 by the Washington Post, the New Yorker, and the Christian Science Monitor. He is the author of the award-winning book, Torchbearers of Democracy, African American Soldiers in the World War I Era, which was the recipient of the 2011 Liberty Legacy Foundation Award from the Organization of American Historians, and the 2011 Distinguished Book Award from the Society for Military History. He is the co-editor of the Charleston Syllabus, Readings on Race, Racism, and Racial Violence and Major Problems in African American History, second edition. He has published articles in leading academic journals and collections, as well as op-eds, essays, and reviews in The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Washington Post, Time, and The Conservation. He has held fellowships at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, the Ford Foundation, and the Institute for Citizens and Scholars. He is currently a W.E.B. Du Bois Fellow at Harvard's Hutchins Center for African and African American Research, where his project, Toward a Biography of Black Studies, contextualizes the formal development of Black studies within the broader history of the 20th and 21st century struggles for Black freedom and justice, and how this in turn has informed the relationship of Black studies to the academy. Hello, Dr. Williams. It's so nice to be able to talk with you today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much. Looking forward to the conversation.
Me too, especially because of your current project. That's so interesting. So we can start with how you got into Black studies as a field.
Yeah, so that's on the surface a simple question, but as we're wont to do, I'm going to complicate it right off the bat. I think the question of how we get into Black studies is actually very vexed, and can be very complex. And I think that's certainly the story in my case. And it really makes me think of two separate questions. First, how do we really pinpoint the origins of Black studies? Certainly as a field, which is something I'm sure we'll talk more about, but also personal. How do we locate the personal origins of Black studies, and how we come to it? And second, and kind of related question is, how does this become even more complicated when we think of Black studies, not necessarily as a field, not just as a field or discipline, however we want to characterize it, but really as a way of living, as a way, as I imagine it, as a way of both seeing and of knowing the world. Really thinking of Black studies, as June Jordan wrote about in 1969, as life studies, really consecrated to the preservation of the person and taking ourselves as the primary sources of information when we think about Black studies. So this is kind of informing my current work, but I think also gets at your question of how did I get into Black studies? I think the simple answer is, when I was a freshman in college at UCLA, taking my first courses, formal courses in African American studies, but really reflecting, I think that I came at Black studies much more early. right? So I think about where I'm from San Francisco, where my parents moved from Oakland when I was just a baby, 1977. I'm dating myself. It's all good. Living in the Western Addition, Fillmore neighborhood, a historically Black neighborhood with a very rich history and legacy of Black history, Black culture, Black politics. Certainly thinking of San Francisco as the birthplace of Black studies, and as we think about it today, San Francisco State, obviously. So one of the things I'm interested in thinking about in terms of your question of how we come at Black studies is really taking place very seriously, right? How place roots us, how it informs our sense of self, our sense of being, our sense of knowing when we approach Black studies, especially in more formal ways. I think there's a number of different experiences, moments when I was growing up where I was engaged in Black studies, Black study, lowercase s, without being necessarily conscious of it. Growing up in a family of collectors, being surrounded by Black memorabilia, from jazz posters to Jim Crow era, memorabilia to books, really being surrounded by Black history, Black intellectual, cultural production in a number of different forms. Listening to Motown, in my dad's car, like I was bombarded with the oldies from the 50s and 60s. Growing up in the 1980s, certainly a really important time for my generation, Black studies scholars of my generation, being exposed to Black politics through Jesse Jackson's presidential runs in 84 and 88, but also to shows like The Cosby Show, just to keep it real. I mean, thinking about what it meant to be Black in very visible ways, but also kind of what it meant to be Black in this very confusing space of the 1980s, which on the one hand were very regressive, very oppressive for Black folks. But you have the expansion of, a Black middle class. Both my parents were lawyers, coming out of the 1960s, the products of that struggle, and the sense of, we had kind of moved beyond, the struggles of the 1960s and of that era into a new period where, Black folks, had the possibility, to have, social, political, and economic capital and access. So really thinking about the complexities of Blackness in that period. Throughout the late 80s and early 90s, being exposed to hip hop. I'm a product of that golden era of hip hop. So I still vividly remember being, I think I may have been either the 7th or 8th grade and getting a bootleg copy of NWA straight out of Compton. And what it meant to hear that opening song, you are now about to witness the strength of street knowledge. It's like, okay, there's something going on here that I need to pay attention to beyond just the beats, beyond just the kind of gratuitous, violence and misogyny. There's, some knowledge here that I need to try and pick up on, right? So what did it mean to be Black, in Los Angeles? What did it mean to be part of this, this Black world that I was really kind of being exposed to? So whether it was the NWA, Public Enemy, KRS-One, groups like X-Clan, being exposed to Black history, Black culture, radical Black nationalism on the one hand versus, Afrocentrism on the other, kind of all these different modes of Black consciousness and expression. So kind of all these, kind of quotidian moments, reading Autobiography of Malcolm X, when I was in the 8th grade, attending Nelson Mandela's visit to Oakland in 1990, following his release from prison, being in the Oakland Coliseum, surrounded by, 60,000 other people and seeing Nelson Mandela, speak to the crowd. All of those moments, I think, really kind of ingrained the importance of Black study, and laid the groundwork, the foundation, if you will, for my more serious engagement in Black studies. I think probably my most formal introduction to Black studies was in high school. And my senior year, I took a year-long course. It was called Step to College. It was a program that was run out of the Ethnic Studies department at San Francisco State. And it was taught by an instructor who was affiliated with the Africana Studies department. And that was, really kind of an eye-opening experience in being exposed to how Black studies could be done in the space of the classroom. So we read Malana Karenga's Introduction to Black Studies. We read Carter G. Woodson, Miseducation of the Negro. I was able to write papers about the history of Kwanzaa and Uzaba, about Brazil and thinking about Blackness in Brazil, writing a paper devoted to Malcolm X. It was also really important that we bought the books for that course at Marcus Books, which is the oldest or one of the oldest independent Black bookstores in the country. I think the oldest west of the Mississippi, founded in 1960, really a staple of the Black community in San Francisco, really highlighting the importance of Black bookstores just a few blocks from my house. So, buying our books for that course in a Black bookstore like Marcus Books was really significant. So when I went to college in 1994, I went to UCLA. I knew that I wanted to engage with Black studies or African American studies, and I guess it was the spring quarter of my first year at UCLA. I took my first course in an African American Studies program. It was a program at the time taught by Robert Hill, Bobby Hill, the Marcus Garvey expert, editor of the Marcus Garvey papers. It was a course on African American nationalism. We read obviously some Marcus Garvey Life and Lessons, but also read 3 Negro classics, which included Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery, W.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, and James Weldon Johnson, Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man. And from that moment on, I knew okay, this is what I want to do. Declared a double major in history and Afro American studies, and from there I was kind of off and running.
So, what keeps you committed to the field now?
I think that Black studies is such a capacious way of approaching certainly our intellectual work, but as I said, approaching life, a way of thinking about how we see the world, the type of questions that we ask, how we approach our place in the world, our sense of vocation, our calling, what excites us, what we're passionate about, and then ultimately how we understand ourselves, right? So again, the sense of seeing and knowing, and I found Black studies to be a way in which I make sense of the questions that I have, whether those are historical, whether those are political, whether those are familial, whether those are deeply personal, right? It's a way of approaching, a way of thinking, a way of wrestling with, I think the complex questions, that confront us on a daily basis. So certainly, I love having a job in in Black studies. It helps to be employed, to be able to do this for a living, to support my family. But it's something that I genuinely enjoy doing. I went to graduate school not knowing anything about academia per se. Certainly being a college student, I mean, we could talk more about, my undergraduate experience. But, I didn't really have a sense of what it meant to be in academia, to be a professor, right? These were just folks that I looked up to and enjoyed learning from, right? I didn't know what it meant to be in that life. Certainly in terms of the vocation of being a professor in academia. I just knew that I loved reading and writing and learning about Black folks, and discussing issues related to Black history, particular. And that's something that I wanted to continue doing. I went to UCLA thinking that I was going to follow in my parents' footsteps and be a lawyer. And, by my junior year, it was clear that I just didn't have passion for it. Still something that I was interested in, but it wasn't something that I saw myself, devoting, my life to, committing to a life in Black studies. And, I went to graduate school, admittedly kind of naive, like, this is something, I want to continue to pursue Black studies, specifically, the study of African-American history. And, through all the twists and turns that inevitably come with being academia, that's something that I continue to hold on to remind myself of, right? That, yes, this is a job. Yes, as Black studies scholars, we have to navigate, this very complex, messy, contradictory, sometimes explicitly oppressive and violent space of academia. But at the end of the day, it's about our commitments, and our commitments to ourselves, our own interests, our passions, and really remembering, the commitments that came with the very creation of Black studies, and our obligations to honor that in various ways. Really embracing the inheritance that Black studies is. Right, especially now. I think we're at a moment where many of the pioneering scholars of Black studies, thinking about John Bracey and Bill Strickland, and especially Nathan Hare, who recently passed away. What have they bequeathed us? And what is our responsibility to take that inheritance seriously? So that's something that I, as a historian, but as someone, as I kind of narrated earlier, with this deep connection to Black studies, I constantly remind myself of, and keeps me motivated to not just remain in the field, but to continue moving it.
For sure. That's something that, like, I have that conversation often. The inheritance and the responsibility to honor the work that came before. It's like and
that's a heavy responsibility.
It is.
Yeah. And, I think that's part of what makes Black studies so unique and so fascinating, especially kind of as a historian. I tend to look at everything in kind of a historical perspective context. But it's just a remarkable story. Black studies has no business being here. Right. The way that it was created, and certainly we could talk about a much longer Black studies tradition, Black intellectual tradition. But, its formal creation, in the context of the late 60s, student protests, just the remarkable circumstances that led to the creation of Black studies. And, folks like Martha Biondi and others have written about this. It's just a story of Black determination, Black ingenuity, Black creativity, Black determination. Um, and the fact that Black Studies is still here 50 plus years later is, really astounding in a lot of ways, because, it certainly could have gone in many other directions, right? So I think just thinking about that historical legacy, um, you know, without necessarily romanticizing it, right? But acknowledging just what a remarkable kind of story that is really important for us in how we approach our work and our sense of vocation.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And that so much of what you have said could go in so many different directions. But I think because you are a historian and in Black studies, I'm curious to hear a little more about how you situate yourself in relation to both fields.
Yeah. So again, I was a double major in history and African American studies in college at UCLA. I had the benefit of a wonderful advisor and mentor in Brenda Stevenson, who I think you've had on the podcast. I still hold her dear to my heart. She basically made me write a senior honors thesis. I approached her about doing an independent studies course, came to her office hours, and she said, "No, you're going to write a senior thesis with me." I was like, "Oh, okay. Well, hey, let's go." So she served as a really, I think, important model for me about how to navigate the relationship between being a historian and being a Black studies scholar. And I think that carried over into how I thought about the work that I was going to do, or what I was getting myself into going to graduate school. But I will say that my undergraduate experience, in Black studies at UCLA, as rich and fulfilling and transformative as it was, did not fully prepare me for graduate school. I went straight from UCLA graduating to graduate school. I was the youngest student in my cohort. I was the only Black male in my cohort. Had never been to the East Coast before. Princeton was a very strange place, to put it lightly. And entering a history department that was very traditional in many ways, but had a certain idea of what it meant to be a historian. And from the jump, taking my first introduction to historical methods course, it was clear that in terms of being introduced to the discipline of history, that entailed a type of discipline, right? We were all in that seminar being disciplined about how to be a good historian and what that means, right? I mean, that was the first time, writing my first paper for that course, I got a migraine headache. I'd never experienced anything like that before in my life. So it made me think, like, what is actually going on here, right? What are they doing to me, right? What am I doing to myself in trying to conform to this idea of what it meant to do history and to be a quote unquote good historian, to do history the right way. So I'm navigating, that tension, but had the incredible benefit of working with Nell Payton as my advisor, Nell Irvin Painter, who, and I think she'll tell you this. She writes about this in a number of her work. She never fit in, and I think that's because she comes directly out of a Black studies tradition. I mean, she's obviously a brilliant historian, right? But she is a deeply interdisciplinary thinker, multidisciplinary thinker. She's an artist, right? She was someone who I can look at and say, okay, you've made it this far, right? But at the same time, you have maintained your integrity in terms of your multidisciplinarity and your commitments to Black studies. Not saying that was easy by any stretch of the imagination, but I did have, that very powerful example, and other examples as well. I really approached the Black studies community at Princeton as my home, much more so than the history department. Being exposed to other Black graduate students, other Black faculty who were at Princeton at the time, being able to actually work in the program for African American Studies office, being able to TA for Cornell West, for example, those were all experiences that kind of reminded me that, okay, I'm doing this history thing, right? And of course, part of being in the academy is knowing how to make yourself legible, particularly as it relates to the market forces of being in the academy, right? Getting a job, getting that first tenure track job, if you're fortunate enough to do so, right? There weren't any jobs, in Black studies, when I was on the market. It was in, history departments. So how to make yourself, legible, in ways that you are marketable. But while at the same time, still, being connected to, various Black studies communities. So as I said, at Princeton, that was, the African American Studies program during my first job at Hamilton College, small liberal arts college in upstate New York, very isolating in many respects, being the only Black professor in a relatively small yet very dysfunctional history department. Trying to find community in that space. The Africana Studies program, not very effective, right? We could have a larger conversation about what it means to be a Black studies program in, these kind of small colleges without a lot of resources, without a lot of faculty, and the particular challenges that they faced. But for me, it was, trying to get out of upstate New York. I had 2 years in New York City at the Schomburg Center. So being part of that community, that space, and, being around, other brilliant interdisciplinary thinkers, as a scholar in residence at the Schomburg Center, right? Reminding me that, okay, on the one hand, we're doing history. My first book is definitely a history book, but it's also, I think, deeply informed by the multidisciplinary nature of Black studies, and pulling from all those different fields, methodologies, was something that was very important to me, particularly in my early career, and still remains very important today in how I think about my work.
What's so interesting that with everything that you've said, but then also with the ways in which so many people talk about their both relationship to Black studies, but also how they got into Black studies, is the multidisciplinary influences of that trajectory, right? And how that is often mirrored in the academy once they get in those spaces. So like Black Studies, yes, everybody has a Black Studies course that they took at some point and was like, yeah, I'm going to stay connected to this. But also, like you were talking about, the NWA's first album, the music, the seeing Nelson Mandela, like all of these things coming together to give you an understanding of like the living of Black life, and then how you take all of these experiences and translate them to how can I continue to do this work in a space that has very specific expectations and ideas about what my career is supposed to look like or what my methods are supposed to look like. I think it's really interesting just the ways that everybody comes to Black studies in all of these different ways, and continues to use those various trajectories and methods and viewpoints as they continue in the field, which I think might be, right, a good place to speak a little bit about your current projects, and the ways in which you're contextualizing the formalization of Black studies within this larger 20th and 21st century struggle for Black freedom.
Yeah, so I think, a few different motivations for this project. One, as I mentioned, approaching it as a form of honoring, of remembrance. I think about a 2014 article that Christina Sharp wrote for the Black Scholar, on Black studies in the wake, or her book had come out. So kind of thinking about Black studies in the wake, thinking about, a type of wake work, and, reflecting upon, honoring, taking seriously the inheritance of Black studies that so many of the pioneering figures in the field have passed on to us. Another important motivation for me doing this project was the 50th anniversary moment, the relatively recent 50th anniversary moment of Black Studies. At the time, I was chair of African American Studies at Brandeis, and organized our big 50th anniversary commemoration. Department was founded, like so many other programs and departments, in early 1969. So this was an opportunity to certainly talk about the birth of the department. And we brought back many of the alumni who were involved in the building takeover, which led to the creation of the department, some of them returning to Brandeis for the first time since graduating, in the late 60s, early 70s. So it was a very emotional moment to have a lot of those people reunited again for the first time, but also recognizing Brandeis's much deeper Black history. So, Angela Davis was one of our keynote speakers, and as was Hortense Spillers. So again, recognizing kind of the traditions, the legacies that were part of certainly our department, but also kind of a larger history of Black folks at Brandeis. So again, kind of thinking about, wow, Black studies 50 plus years later, but then again, kind of going back to this idea of Black studies in the wake, just a few years, after that, here we are, and Black studies is under attack in many ways. And, that was probably best exemplified by, the controversy surrounding the AP African Studies curriculum. And, thinking about, okay, what does it mean, that Black studies is simultaneously flourishing in many ways, but at the same time is still under attack, right? It is still fighting for its survival, right? Still fighting for its legitimacy. So kind of thinking about that history of kind of progress and struggle, right? But then how to narrate that? I think there's been a number of books that have done a very good job of kind of laying out the history of Black studies, particularly in the academy. The origins of Black studies, in the context of the Black freedom struggle in the 60s and even into the early 70s. But I'm interested in taking kind of a more personal approach. Again, thinking about Black studies as life studies, and I'm also thinking about Josh Meyer's really amazing recent book of Black studies, where he kind of takes up this calling as well, and looking at Du Bois, Sylvia Winters, Jacob Carruthers, and Cedric Robinson. What would it mean to write a quote unquote history? I use that term kind of loosely. Of Black studies. That puts myself kind of at the center of it. That takes my own experiences, my own life in Black studies, kind of as the point of reference, and to kind of work out from that, to build upon it, to tease out from my own varied experiences, what this could tell us about the history, the development of Black studies, how it connects to these larger issues of Black struggle and Black progress. So yeah, it's an approach that I think I'm excited about, because I think we have to kind of recognize Black studies as certainly as an intellectual, as an academic enterprise, but more than anything else, and this is what makes Black studies so unique, it is deeply intimate. I would argue more so than any other field or discipline. Black studies is intimately connected to the interiority of our lives.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's what gives Black studies its power, its uniqueness, right? Its longevity, right? Because it's always speaking to who we are, who we have been, who we want to be, right? So, I don't know what this book is going to look like at the end of the day, but again, that's part of that's what Black studies is, just kind of that searching for the answer, right? Asking questions and pulling from whatever we have at our disposal to try and figure out what the answers are.
I'm very excited for when this book comes out, whenever it's done.
Be soon. We'll see.
That I think that the point about Black studies being very intimately tied to our lives, like individually, Black studies it's a much more personal path to take than some of the other fields or disciplines, and not just in the ways that we might come to it, but also in the research itself, right? Like it's I have this conversation with my sister, because she's getting her PhD in history, but she focuses on the enslaved, the resistance strategies and kinship networks of enslaved women in Jamaica in the 18th century. And like, this is it's not work that's unheavy. It's not work that does not intersect, right, with personal identities and perspectives and histories. And it's a different type of work to engage in when you know that there is overlap and intersection, maybe not with you personally, but like with the people that look like you and what they had to go through for you to get to where you are now.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that was very intentional in the formation of Black studies, right? To really maintain that connection, the relevancy, right? That was the term used during the time. How are we going to create a system of education, a curriculum, a university an experience that is relevant to our lives, and then making that relevant to the everyday lives and struggles of Black folks, right? So I think that still is really important today. Certainly on a personal level, how is Black studies relevant to our personal lives? But then thinking about its broader relevancy, right? And I think that's a very vexed question that I think we need to really take seriously now in terms of how we approach Black studies, because what was relevant in 1969 isn't necessarily as relevant in 2024, right? I think the idea of or the relationship between Black studies and the quote unquote Black community, right, and making Black studies relevant to the Black community is something we need to I think complicate in ways that are not as nostalgic as I think the terms of that conversation tend to be, right? Yes, there needs to be a way that we connect to Black folks beyond the academy. But what does that actually look like? What does that mean, right? How do we define community, right? We have to be very careful in kind of throwing that term around too loosely, right? What does it mean, that I might have the majority of the Black students in one of my classes, be first, second generation African immigrants, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or from Puerto Rico or from the DR, right? What does it mean that we have a Black professional and leadership class, that positions themselves very differently, in our contemporary moment than what existed in the late 60s and early 70s, right? So, I think, there's ways in which we need to, I think more critically about how we approach this idea of Black studies relevancy and relationship to the quote unquote community, and just how we think about kind of this other larger question of audience, right? Who we do our work for, and how we make our work accessible, in ways that can be relevant.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Not necessarily dictating what that relevancy is going to be, because, again, I think, just what it means to be Black is so complex and multi-layered, right? Offering, a kind of Black studies prescriptive, isn't, a formula for success, right? But, how do we present our work in ways that it can be made, relevant in a number of different ways, by all the different, dimensions of our Black community support.
Yes, I think that is a conversation that I have had many times recently. Like, what is that? What is the relationship between this formalized institution of Black studies and Black communities, plural? Because as you said, like, what do we mean by community, and how does that community look different than it might have looked 50 years ago? Which also makes me think about the ways in which Black studies looks, or what Black studies does in the classroom, because the Black studies classroom is also different than it was 50 years ago. the college classroom is different than it was 50 years ago. What does that mean for what we do in teaching Black studies today?
Yeah, I think that's an important question. And I go back to the question of space. What does Black studies look like in different spaces and places? Right? So using my own experience as an example, teaching African American history, Black studies at a small liberal arts college in upstate New York, very different than teaching in a Black studies department at Brandeis University, which is its own very unique, strange institute. I mean, all these institutions, all these schools are strange places.
They're all weird.
They're all weird, but they're all different though. Right? And again, I think as Black studies teachers, we have to be aware of the spaces we're teaching in. And that means being aware of the history of those spaces, right? And how that history consciously and unconsciously shapes the type of teaching that we do, and the students who come into our classroom, right? So I think part of the challenge, beyond just the challenge of the work itself, right? As you said earlier, the weight of the work, the pedagogical rigor, that is required to be a Black studies scholar, right? It's not easy to think interdisciplinarily, multidisciplinary, right? Especially, when we're trained, disciplined into a particular discipline, right? To then step out of that and create a course like Introduction to African American Studies, which incorporates, history, which incorporates sociology, which incorporates film, which incorporates, the visual arts, which incorporates, performance, all these different aspects of what Black studies is, right? So that's not easy to do, right? And then being aware of, the students who step into our classroom and where they're coming and their own varied experiences, how their sense of expectations for what a Black studies course entails will run the spectrum, right? From folks who are deeply invested, right? Who may know more than you sometimes, to those students who are like, yeah, I'm just taking this for credit, or like, before I graduate, I thought it would be a good idea to take at least, one Black studies class, right? So, you have to be able to be very nimble in how you approach teaching in a Black studies space, because you're going to have students coming from so many different perspectives, so many different backgrounds, different sets of expectations. But I do go back to, I think, the importance of really grounding students in, first, the history of Black studies, what Black studies is, where it comes from, but also giving them a sense of investment, connectivity to the place, the school, the institution that they're in, right? And how transformative that can be. So just to give you an example, at Brandeis, I developed a course. It was titled Black Brandeis, Black History. And this was based on a lot of my own archival research, as well as preparing for our 50th anniversary commemoration, but really tracing the history of Black people at Brandeis from the institution's founding through the present, and exposing students to this history that they knew nothing about, knew absolutely nothing about, and having them see the work of Black studies in a much different way, but also seeing their own identity as students in a very different. right? And especially Black students, right? Who, so many times, they come into our classes and they're deeply disillusioned, beat down, looking for us to help prop them up. Part of being a Black studies teacher is also being a therapist and a counselor, for better or for worse,
Mm-hmm.
right? Connecting them to a history, a legacy that, is also very empowering as well, right? So, kind of getting them to see themselves in a different way, getting them to see themselves as students in a different way. So I think those are all, things that, as Black studies educators, we have to be aware of.
Thank you. That first of all, I think that the idea of having a class that roots Black studies in the institution, as well as thinking about like the larger field, is really interesting, and I'm sure that definitely helped to have that connection for students in a way that they hadn't thought about, especially when they're coming to class being disillusioned or being like over the situation that they're in, and what they've had to encounter so far to get that affirmation or that knowledge that they are connected to this longer trajectory.
And, no fault of their own for being disillusioned.
Yeah.
And especially this generation. I mean, I remember, 2015 and having to teach, in the wake of, Ferguson and Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, that first kind of Black Lives Matter moment. Those were really difficult classes, right? They're reading Assata Shakur's autobiography and connecting it to, the things that are happening around, every day, right? Wondering what do we do, and but then acting upon it, right?
Mm-hmm. So
those are, I think we have to acknowledge, kind of the particular challenges that this generation of students has faced. Be empathetic to that, but also find ways to not let their well-justified trauma become debilitating, right? And that's the challenge of teaching and doing Black studies, right? Using it as a source of empowerment as well.
For sure. Like that's being able to emphasize and teach that ability of Black studies to be used as a source of empowerment is critical, especially if you're thinking about the ways that Black people and Black history are so often framed outside of Black study spaces. And it's all depressing and oppressive and doesn't necessarily emphasize that innovation and determination and creation that continually happens out of necessity, but it continues to happen. Black studies provides that lens that's so necessary to combat that.
For sure.
So 2 more questions. So although we've kind of talked about this, I'm going to ask you the question, and then if you want to elaborate on something you said previously, that's fine too. But what interests you most about the past of Black studies?
Yeah, so again, I think just as a historian, I find the history of Black studies to be deeply fascinating. I'm constantly learning new things, new stories. Doing this current project, I've been talking to my parents a lot. They're connections to Black studies when they were college students, as well as also when they were in law school. So, there's just so many fascinating layers to the story of Black studies and its development. And I think it's really important that, especially now, we find a way to preserve those stories. So kudos to you and the work that you're doing with this project, in creating an archive, right? Creating a Black Studies archive that future generations will be able to look back on and learn from. So really just kind of doing that work of learning about and documenting and telling those stories is something that continues to interest me and excites me. But I think it's this question of how do we actually use what we've learned, right? How do we use that to be fully engaged with the various meanings of what it means to be Black today, right? The complexities of Blackness, the breadth of the Black experiences, the myriad challenges that Black folks continue to face. So, I think that excites me because Black Studies has that potential. It always has, but I think, in a critical sense, we need to be aware of, what does it mean to approach Black Studies as a political project, right? In our current times, which are a mess in so many ways, right? And I kind of go back to this question of audience and legibility of, how do we make our work accessible, right? Another really important issue that I'm kind of thinking about with this project. And I think there's so many interesting conversations and debates that happen around this. And on one hand, there's folks who are deeply committed to the academic work, which is critical of demonstrating Black studies, indispensability to the academy, further legitimizing it as an academic discipline. But then on the other hand, you have folks, who are, really approaching Black studies, with their eye towards a much larger, audience. And, I think of, just off the top of my head, like the work that Kendi's doing. And certainly we could probably have a whole podcast devoted, to Ibram and his work and all the debates surrounding it. But, I think there's something to be said for, producing Black studies work for children, right? Of making Zora Neale Hurston accessible to a larger audience, right? Of entering into different communication spaces, whether that's having, a documentary on Netflix or having a very visible social media presence, knowing how to navigate TikTok or whatever the case may be, right? I think, something that interests me about, Black studies, both in the present as well as moving forward, is how do we reimagine our connection to different audiences, and how do we then root that in, kind of the best traditions of Black studies, right? Not trying to replicate what was done in the past, because the past is the past, right? How do we learn from that and then find new creative, innovative ways to continue to make our work relevant and to connect with various audiences so that we can effectively speak to and impact the really important issues that we're confronting today.
Thank you. That's such an important question. And like the question of audience is one that always has struck me. Just in general, I was trained by a lot of rhetoricians, and audience has always been a primary question in my work and in my classroom. So that's something that really resonates with me. So I'm glad that that resonates with other people too. But thank you so much for your time. Is there anything you'd like to add or end on?
No, I'll again just commend you on the work that you're doing. Again, as a historian, I have
Thank
deep
you.
and and respect for the historical archiving that you're doing, of acknowledging the history of Black studies and how it continues to shape the work that we're doing today. So yes, it's an honor to be a part of this conversation.
It's such an honor to have you here. And like, honestly, I have learned so much from this. Like, I appreciate how generous and how informative everyone has been with their time and their information and their past and contextualizing things. Like, yeah, I think that this has been a whole re-education for me in Black studies in a way that I had not envisioned. So I'm infinitely grateful to everybody who is on the podcast, as well as to my colleague, John Dravinsky, for suggesting a podcast, because that was his idea, not mine. But I'm so glad we did it.
Citationality, that's right.
But thank you again so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Too. Thank you.